To the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 2 on Out of the Silent Planet, and we're hoping actually to get to Malacandra today, so that would be a good thing. I'm going to try to move along more efficiently than I did last time, which is kind of a resolution I've made a lot over the course of my career. Anyway, off we go. Okay, no, not off we go. First, 2 quick announcements. We have three quick announcements. We have 2 moots upcoming. Our regional moot season, our spring season is beginning here soon. We have 2 moots coming up in the month of February. On February 8th, we have Tex Moot down in Houston, Texas. And our own Trish Lambert is going to be the keynote speaker there. So I hope you'll be able to join us there if you're anywhere in the Texas area. Again, that's Saturday, February 8th. And then on the 22nd of February, 2 weeks later, we have SoCal Moot out in Los Angeles. In fact, it's going to be in Hollywood. Actually, we're holding SoCal Moot at the Netflix headquarters this year, which is kind of awesome. So that's what we're doing on the 22nd of February out in Hollywood. You can find more information on both of these moots on the signumuniversity.org homepage. Just scroll down a little bit. So yeah. Oh, Jocelyn, yeah, there's a good reason you don't know about that yet, because we were only just announcing this finally. We were having some wanting to make. I've been wanting to announce that for a while, but we needed to confirm it, so we finally received confirmation, and so can confirm it. The registration isn't open for SoCal Moot yet. That'll be coming out soon. But so I just wanted to mention it in a save the date kind of way. And the call for papers and presentations is open there. So if you want to give a presentation or think about participating in a discussion, you should definitely look into that. Information is on the page there. So anyway, and the third really quick one is that this is Wednesday. We're in the middle of our first week of the spring semester in our MA program, our Signum MA program. It's not too late to join some of our classes, especially if you wanted to join in as an auditor. You can even join in to take the courses for credit still for the first 2 weeks, but obviously sooner is better than later when it comes to joining the class, as you're missing stuff already. So but definitely happy to have folks, especially people who want to audit, especially if you wanted to audit the new live course that we're offering this term, which is our Classical Myths and Legends class. So anyway, there we are. Too old not to. The SoCal Moot page isn't up yet. Okay, sorry, I overstepped there. Save the date. Again, save the date. The page will be up soon. So that's again the 22nd of February. And I'm getting ahead of myself here in my excitement about the confirmation. So more information will be available soon. But do keep that in mind, and you can begin thinking through your proposal for a presentation for that. So there we go. Thank you, Too Old Not To, on the Twitch chat there for pointing that out. Okay. All right. Now let us get back to the text. So we had just blasted off. We were standing out from Earth at 85,000 miles, and Ransom was coping with this fact for the first time. And this begins the really kind of the meat of the entire book, really. Lewis is quite unapologetic about the fact that for him, one of the things that he really loves about science fiction as a genre is the way that it enables us to, it is for him very like fantasy. The two of them are very similar. They're not exactly the same, but they're very similar. And the things that they have in common, the fundamental things that fantasy and science fiction have in common, is the what if games that you can play, right? The way in which one's imagination is not totally free to go in totally different ways. So for instance, he's not imagining that on Malacandra gravity doesn't work, or gravity works the opposite way, or something like that, right? There are sort of rules. He's still operating generally within the rules of our solar system, at least the rules of our solar system as they were understood and as he was imagining them. But there's still a lot of scope for imagination, and both in the terms of imagining what something would be like, what it would be like to be out in space, or like a what if it were like this to be out in space, right? And then given a certain set of parameters, what might life be like? What might civilization be like on another planet, right? Those are the kinds of imaginative games that Lewis is going to be playing, and that's where he's really interested. That's what he's really interested in. A lot of people, of course, dislike the spaceship, right? His spaceship. And he himself, again, he makes no effort to explain like the science behind it, right? In fact, I think it's fairly clever, the fact that Weston refuses to explain the science, right? Because he says to Ransom, you certainly wouldn't understand it, and if there were any concern that you might understand it, you would certainly not be told. So the sort of the secrecy of Weston is, all of the excuse that he needs for not explaining it, and I think that's a little bit clever anyway. But he is not at all interested in the mechanism of the thing, right? He is not at all interested in how the spaceship travels. He needs to get Ransom from Earth to Malacandra so that Ransom can have these experiences on Malacandra, so Ransom can go through what he goes through. That's what he's really interested in, right? And it's not that he's uninterested in the journey. He's very interested in the journey through space. He's just not interested in the mechanism of the journey, right? He's not interested in the motive power of what drives the spaceship or how fast it's going or anything like that, right? What he is interested in is the experience of being in the heavens, as we'll get to here in our early passages. But I think it's different people will react to it different ways. Some people love the how part, and as we've talked about before, there's whole sort of, subgenres of science fiction that are intensely interested in the how. Those that Lewis in one of his essays called the fiction of the engineers, which is fine. Like, he doesn't say that in scorn. It's like, that is what it is. People like that, and that's fine. So if your tastes don't run alongside Lewis's here, that's okay. What I would ask, though, and what I think is important when reading a book like this, is it's perfectly legitimate to say, I see the kind of thing that this book is interested in, and I'm not as interested in the kinds of things that it's interested in. So, like, this book and I will agree to disagree, right? This book and I we can kind of go our separate ways because we're kind of not interested in the same thing, right? The thing that sometimes I get a little bit twitchy about is when people basically try to criticize the book for doing poorly something it's not even making any attempt to do, which it has no interest in doing at all. So that's the part that I get a little cranky about sometimes. Just on general principle, I think it's not about defending this book. It's about, I think, just kind of good approaches to reading. The important thing is to try to figure out, like, what is this book doing and what is this book interested in? And you don't have to share its interests, but it's not quite fair to essentially say, I don't like this book because it isn't another book, which is essentially what you're saying if what you're wanting is more about the mechanism of space travel. Yeah. Yeah, good. David says, the thing I find annoying is that the one instance Lewis tried to explain something, the gravity on the ship, he got the strength of the gravity quite badly wrong. Well, Lewis is no scientist, doesn't pretend to be, and I find the one thing I would say there is simply 1930s, right? I mean, it's hard for us to... It's hard for us, as I was saying on the last slide we were looking at last week, it's hard for us to enter into the full kind of emotional experience of what the word and the concept of space evoked for people in the 30s, right? I mean, it's just... not only is it different in the 2020s, it's different. It was different in the 1970s, after the moonwalk. It's just, things are not the same. Nor, of course, I think are things the same after Star Trek and Star Wars, honestly. So that's one sort of example along those lines. But the other thing, David, that I keep coming back to there is, again, like, we've seen so many, videos of like real astronauts on real spaceships and what things are like. It's hard to kind of put us back into a place of imagining completely what it's, knowing nothing, right? Knowing nothing firsthand and trying to sort of guess. But again, it's not about guessing. That's one of the things that some science fiction books do, is try to get it all right? Try to guess exactly how things would work under these circumstances and everything. And Lewis does some of that, but it's not about, it's not the science that he's interested in, really, right? What he's interested in are these two things, namely space and the foreign planet, as the framework for an imagined world, right? And having, and he invites us to enter into this secondary world that he's creating. And that invitation and those secondary worlds are not qualitatively different. Like, that process on our part as readers is not qualitatively different from the invitation that we get, when we're reading The Hobbit, for instance, right? And we're being invited to invest secondary belief in a secondary world, right? In fact, again, in some of his essays on science fiction, one of the things that he talks about there is simply how one of the reasons that he finds science fiction to be a genre very naturally increasing in popularity, I mean to say, in the 20th century, over the course of the 20th century, is that it's not just that space, like plausible space travel, is getting closer and closer. The point that he makes is that terra incognita on Earth is smaller and smaller, right? He goes back to, he sort of does this experiment, thinking back and saying, in the 15th and 16th century, in order to have a like otherworldly setting for your story, you just had to go deep into the forest, right? And that was terra incognita, and who knows what could be going on in there, right? Then later on, after the 18th century, you have to go to islands like Brobdingnag and Lilliput, right, way out across the oceans. But soon the whole world, and then you have to, like Jules Verne, go to the center of the earth, right? Or then, but so like basically as our actual exploration advances, and as terra incognita, which, opens vistas for imagination, right? As that moves further and further out, space is not the final frontier, but in Lewis's argument, the next logical frontier, right? For that imaginative context. And that's one of the things that he's doing. Yeah, Colette says that he's glad. She's glad he got some of the science wrong, and glad he didn't focus on it. It's a much more enchanting read, especially now. You can feel the sheer wonder of the journey. Yes, Colette, I agree. In many ways, I agree. A book which attempted to accurately predict what it would really be like, based upon all possible available scientific evidence and speculation, what space travel would actually be like and feel like. Someone who wrote a book like that, even if they were very remarkably accurate in predicting that, I would find that book much less interesting to read than I find this book. Anyway, but Karina, no, you're certainly right. Space, the next logical frontier, does not have the same ring to it. You're certainly correct about that. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Anyway, let's stop talking about the text, and let's actually go on and talk about the text. This is Ransom speaking with Weston. "And you say this place is inhabited?" said Ransom. Weston gave him a peculiar look and then nodded. The uneasiness which this produced in Ransom rapidly merged in an anger which he had almost lost sight of amidst the conflicting emotions that beset him. "And what has all this to do with me?" he broke out. "You have assaulted me, drugged me, and are apparently carrying me off as a prisoner in this infernal thing. What have I done to you? What do you say for yourself?" "I might reply by asking you why you crept into my backyard like a thief. If you had minded your own business, you would not be here. As it is, I admit that we have had to infringe your rights. My only defense is that small claims must give way to great. As far as we know, we are doing what has never been done in the history of man, perhaps never in the history of the universe. We have learned how to jump off the speck of matter on which our species began. Infinity, and therefore perhaps eternity, is being put into the hands of the human race. You cannot be so small-minded as to think that the rights or the life of an individual or of a million individuals are of the slightest importance in comparison with this." "I happen to disagree," said Ransom, "and I have always disagreed, even about vivisection. But you haven't answered my question. What do you want me for? What good am I to you on this Unmalakandra?" Okay, so this is one of the core concepts underlying the book, right? This is one of the core things that the book is addressing, especially in this early part, right? And Weston is the spokesperson for this modern idea, right? Modern in the 1930s. And very increasingly culturally significant idea, right? About the advance of science, right? And about progress with a capital P and what this means. Weston is an idealist, right? He is not, it seems fairly clear to me that Weston he's not making any attempt, Lewis, rather, sorry, I should be a little more clear with my pronouns. Lewis is not, I think, trying to sort of say anything in particular about physics or physicists, right? Weston, I think, is not meant to be read as, you know, a sort of a caricature or like a portrait or even a caricature, I should say, of a physicist or a great physicist. He is the modern intellectual. He's the stand-in for the voice piece, essentially, of the modern intellectual, right? The 1930s intellectual who believes very wholeheartedly in all of these things, right? In these high ideals. Infinity and therefore perhaps eternity is being put into the hands of the human race to advance the human race, to further that ineluctable advancement of the human race that we are all caught up in. That is the highest end. And Weston, although he acknowledges that it's wrong to do what he did to Ransom, right? Remember, he even said that to Divine. He resisted bringing Ransom instead of bringing the neighbor boy, right? He wanted to bring the neighbor boy because he was arguing that the neighbor boy basically didn't have rights, right? Being a bit simple, as his mom said, Weston considers him subhuman, right? And so, he's like a lab rat to Weston. Ransom, although Weston doesn't approve of Ransom, he nevertheless acknowledges that Ransom, as an intelligent, if misguided, human being, is at least a human being, right? And has some kind of claim. However, look, there's no question about the fact that the claims of one person obviously totally outweighed by the good of the entire human race and of the spectacular significance of this program that they are caught up in, right? Ransom disagrees. I don't know. Good, Jennifer, that's exactly what I wanted to address. I think that to many modern people, the reference to vivisection might seem a little bit odd, or even a bit like a non sequitur. So vivisection, of course, vivisection means cutting open and experimenting on animals while they are still alive, right? So cutting open like a rat or a cat or a dog or something while it lives to be able to see how its systems are working, right? A technique, of course, is for increasing our understanding of the biological system, basically. But there were many who said it's wrong. Like, I don't care if it's just a cat or a dog or a rat. You are inflicting horrible pain on that creature, and the ends don't justify the means. Yes, through the research you are doing through your vivisection, you may be gaining knowledge that could be used to, for good ends, right? That could be used to help cure diseases and further surgical techniques and all these kinds of things. But again, so this was a hot topic in the first quarter of the 20th century. And there were a lot of people. One other contemporary example jumps to my mind. You may, if you're a murder mystery fan and you have read any Dorothy Sayers, the Lord Peter Wimsey books, in the very first Lord Peter Wimsey adventure, Whose Body, the guy, I'm pretty sure it's the guy who ends up as the corpse, he goes around handing out anti-vivisection pamphlets from door to door in his apartment building because it's a cause that he cares about very much. Anyway, so Jocelyn, I'm a huge fan of Dorothy Sayers, as Tolkien was not, at least not of the Lord Peter Wimsey books. But I'm a big fan of all of the Lord Peter Wimsey stuff. Anyway, sorry. So vivisection is, so the reason Ransom brings up vivisection here, right? He is saying, I've disagreed, and I've always disagreed, even about vivisection, right? So even on small scale things, right? The question of, is it or is it not okay to kidnap me and bring me off to my death, right? That's one thing. But I mean, so not only do I not support that, do I think you've got your ends and means messed up there, but I didn't even, I even have always disagreed about vivisection, right? And that seems like such a small thing in comparison. That is the sort of the thrust of his argument here. Yes. And Bruce, you're absolutely right that it is important that this is before World War II. And so this has it is important for us to remember that this is happening before the, big stories of atrocities in World War II and that kind of thing. Anyway. Okay. These issues now, as we see in chapter 6 through 10, which we are in fact going to get to tonight, Weston and Devine drop out of the story. Weston and Devine are here at the beginning, and for the trip up, they're going to go away. They're going to come back, right? We're going to come back to them near the end of the story. So they serve not quite as a framing mechanism, but when we come back to them, it's going to be sort of interesting to see them. Here's another example, actually, of, and this is different. This is not like a kind of science fiction thing, but it's another example of people sometimes judging a book to fail at a thing which it is not attempting, right? And this, okay. All right. I'm trying to think of neutral ways to talk about this. Because I don't want to sound like I just have it in for modern literature. A very great deal of modern literary reception is focused on characters. In fact, well-rounded, believable, and dynamic characters may possibly be like the sine qua non of modern literature. Like if your book doesn't have that, it's not good, and it kind of doesn't matter what else it does. If someone can read your book and say, these characters are flat, or these characters are static, then like that's very damning. There's very little that's more damning. And if a book has well-rounded and dynamic characters, many other flaws in it are overlooked, so long as its characters are really good. This is just, it's just kind of a fixation of the modern world. I emphasize that it's a fixation of the modern world because sometimes people will talk as if that's the only, like, that is like the definition of good literature, you know. And this, the reason this is kind of a sensitive point for me is that, you know, in my experience over the years as a medievalist teaching medieval literature, it drives me bonkers when people who are like completely steeped, or rather cloistered within the modern perspective, go back to works of a different era and are like, yeah, characters were so flat, like this story sucked. And I'm like, okay, like there are other ways, there are other kinds of excellence that a story can have. There are other values that we can apply when we're looking at, like, that's not the only thing, and our fixation on that is comparatively modern. Anyway, Lewis is not ignorant of this, but he speaks again in some of his critical essays, his literary critical essays. He speaks about how, like, there are in fact other things in stories, and how in some kinds of stories you don't want well-rounded and dynamic characters. Like, for instance, one of the arguments that he makes about Lewis Carroll, right? He gives Lewis Carroll as an example and says, Alice, of course, in Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, Alice is not neither a very dynamic nor a very well-rounded character. Like, she's deliberately a flat and not enormously interesting in and of herself character. And that's why the books are successful, because everything else around her is so strange and so bizarre, right? That having Alice as this sort of safe touchstone enables the rest of that story to work. Amber says Lovecraft's characters are an afterthought at best. The ideas are the thing. Exactly. There are so many things that that you can do. Sometimes it's about it's about plot. Sometimes it's about ideas. Sometimes even it's about like atmosphere, even more than it's about characters. Anyway, I say all these things because Weston and Devine are not designed to be dynamic characters, right? The two of them are there in large part, I would say, to represent or to voice ideas, right? You've got Ransom on the one hand, and you've got Weston and Devine on the other hand, and you've got the two of them because the two of them represent very different sides of, you know, one of the things that's happening here in this book is we have a dramatization of the implications of these trends of modern thought at the time in the 30s, right? Weston and Devine both are spokespeople. Like, they both give voice to one of two different kinds of very sort of trendy modern thinking, right? And they're not supposed to be dynamic characters. They're not supposed to change. They're not mere caricature either. But they're not supposed to be well-rounded characters either. We're not supposed to really like invest in them as people. We don't invest in Weston as a person. Less so certainly in this book. Weston gets a little bit more in Paralandra, actually. He comes back in Paralandra briefly. We get a little bit more of him as a character in Paralandra than we get here. But again, primarily, they are the spokesperson the spokesperson of these ideas. And that's okay. And again, especially like Lewis himself said of Lewis Carroll in Through the Looking Glass, right? In this book is really interested not in the characters, but in the stuff outside, right? What they encounter. And not just in the sub-creation of Malacandra, but in how the exploration of this sub-creation of Malacandra, how that informs our ideas. Ultimately, we are looking back at the Silent Planet, right? We are looking back at our world. This is a book that is, at the end of the day, not really about Malacandra. It's really about Earth, right? That's where the primary interest is. But by bringing us to Malacandra, it gives us an entirely new perspective on all of these earthly things, right? And Weston and Divine are the representatives and spokespersons of two of those dominant perspectives. And it's crucial that they're not gonna change, right? Because when we come back and meet them again, Ransom is gonna be seeing things from an entirely new perspective by then, right? And hopefully we, in traveling along with him, will also have had some really interesting opportunities to refresh our own perspective. So when we meet Weston and Divine again at the end, and they have not changed, and they are still what they were, and still representing what they represented at the beginning, the experience of encountering them again at the end is meant to be a little bit shocking. Not because they're different, but because they're the same, but because we're different, right? And I think that's a really neat, I think that's a really nifty project that it's undertaking. Colette, it absolutely would. Developing Weston and Divine too much as individual characters would muddy the ideas and distract from the plot. It absolutely would. It's crucial that they remain static in that way in order for the book to accomplish its end. Now, you don't like the end? Again, if it doesn't speak to you, if you're not interested in that kind of story, it's okay. Nobody can force you to like that kind of thing, right? But again, the thing that I think is only fair is to first see what the story is in fact trying to do, and not, pronounce it a bad story because it fails to do the thing that it isn't attempting to do, is the thing. Anyhow, yeah. Oh, Sarah, cool. Yeah, no, it is. This is a kind of, unless you read a substantial amount of non-modern literature, it's something you can totally take for granted. The whole character-centric thing of modern literature. It's a comparatively new thing. It's not to say that there was no such thing as character development or anything. I'm not making those kinds of exaggerations, but it wasn't about that, and that was certainly not the fixation of things. Anyway, okay. Carita says that Weston and Divine are one or two steps removed from characters in a morality play. Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about them, actually. And then Carita goes on to ask, if they were in a morality play, what would they be named? Well, one thing I can tell you, Carita, is that Divine's name, I think, is deliberately ironic, right? As his attitude is exactly about the profane, right? Not about the divine. Yeah, I don't know. That's a really interesting question. But we'll come back to that. Maybe. Carita, again, when we meet them again near the end of the book, that'll be that would be an interesting time to return to this to that question. Okay. Let's go on. Well, said Ransom, you hold all the cards, and I must make the best of it. I consider your philosophy of life raving lunacy. I suppose all that stuff about infinity and eternity means that you think you are justified in doing anything, absolutely anything, here and now, on the off chance that some creatures or other descended from man as we know him may crawl about a few centuries longer in some part of the universe. Yes, anything whatever, returned the scientist sternly, and all educated opinion, for I do not call classics and history and such trash education, is entirely on my side. I am glad you raised the point, and I advise you to remember my answer. In the meantime, if you will follow me into the next room, we will have breakfast. Be careful how you get up. Your weight here is hardly appreciable compared with your weight on Earth. Brian and Bruce are both wondering if Weston's name is meant to suggest that he's like the epitome of modern Western thought, maybe something like that. It kind of works in some ways. Ransom does not spend much time arguing his side of things, right? He doesn't try to dispute with Weston. The closest thing that he does is this characterization in that first paragraph there. Right? He takes Weston's claim, right? Weston's grandiose description about it we are being handed infinity and possibly eternity. This is like the future of the human race is in our hands. That's how Weston talks, right? Ransom essentially argues that's all propaganda, right? That's all window dressing. Here's the actual reality that you're describing, right? What you're saying is that your end, the goal that you have in mind, is to ensure that some creatures or other descended from man as we know him may crawl about a few centuries longer in some part of the universe. That is your grandiose idea about the future of man, right? Yeah. Yes. So he not only is saying the ends don't justify the means, he's also saying you're kind of fooling yourself about the ends, right? Or rather, the rhetoric that you use, even in your own head, Weston, the rhetoric that you use with yourself about this grand ideal that you have is not honest, right? It is putting big labels and grandiose ideas upon very doubtful and uncertain things. You want our descendants to go on living for a really long time. Is it good that they should do so? Right? Will they be happy if they do so? Like it's the assumption that end is a worthy end in itself. He's pointing to like, what is the core of your belief, right? Why do you want that end? Why do you think that end is so wonderful that it justifies you in any means that you could take along the way here? It's worth killing other people in order that maybe you increase the odds that something somehow descended from us under what circumstances we don't know may exist for a little bit longer, maybe, right? That's like, why do it? Why do it? And yes, Arthur, Weston's speech here makes it clear that C.S. Lewis is a humanities guy. Absolutely. Absolutely. And Sarah, you're absolutely right that Weston does get points for being non-egocentric. Yes, he is an idealist. He believes in something that is greater than himself. And this is something, I think this is an important thing to notice, Sarah, in Weston's philosophy, right? In attempting to sort of encapsulate this modern trend of thought in the 30s, this same tide of thought that leads to eugenics and everything else, all of that kind of stuff. He is not saying, really at heart, it's all like base and crude and like these people are all just arrogant and selfish and arrogant, yes, but he's not saying that, right? He acknowledges that Weston he is an idealist. He has ideals, right? Ransom questions the ground of his ideals, right? What really does that end you're shooting for boil down to? Have you ever really thought it through in cold prose, Weston? Right? Is what Ransom is doing here. But he's not denying that Weston is in fact wanting something, not for himself, and believes in something greater than himself. That, Sarah, I think is the primary the primary difference, basically, between Weston and Divine, right? Divine is very self-centered, right? Divine does not have lofty ideals. That is where divine is sort of the flip side of the coin there. And it's interesting. Stephen says that it's not a problem with being self-centered, but with being empty. Yes. And trying to puncture this sort of empty rhetoric of this sort of kind of idealism is one of the things that Lewis, I think, is fairly clearly attempting here. Yeah. Yeah, good. Okay, let's keep going. Now we get to the experience of traveling in space. All this, as I have said, was sufficiently disquieting. That is, his thought about being kidnapped and taken to a foreign land by force for some reason he doesn't know, and all that kind of thing. The odd thing was that it did not very greatly disquiet him. It is hard for a man to brood on the future when he is feeling so extremely well as Ransom now felt. There was an endless night on one side of the ship and an endless day on the other. Each was marvelous, and he moved from the one to the other at his will, delighted. In the nights, which he could create by turning the handle of a door, he lay for hours in contemplation of the skylight. The earth's disk was nowhere to be seen. The stars, thick as daisies on an uncut lawn, reigned perpetually with no cloud, no moon, no sunrise to dispute their sway. There were planets of unbelievable majesty and constellations undreamed of. There were celestial sapphires, rubies, emeralds, and pinpricks of burning gold. Far out on the left of the picture hung a comet, tiny and remote, and between all and behind all, far more emphatic and palpable than it showed on earth, the undimensioned, enigmatic blackness. The lights trembled. They seemed to grow brighter as he looked. Stretched naked on his bed, a second Danae, he found it night by night more difficult to disbelieve in old astrology. Almost he felt, wholly he imagined, sweet influence, pouring or even stabbing into his surrendered body. First, let me just make sure everybody understands the references there. A second Danae, what does that mean? This is where we need, I don't know, a class in classical myths and legend. Oh, wait, we're offering one this term. What's that? Who was Danae? Lover of Zeus. Yep. But what's the important bit? This is from Greek mythology. In what form? Zeus has slept with women in many different forms. In what form does Zeus appear to Danae? Do you remember? Anybody remember? Well, mythology quiz. Yes, David, you got it. She is the one who is locked in a tower by, I believe, her father. And he comes to her in a beam of light, a shower of golden light, which descends upon her and enters into her. Yes. Yes, that is what he is comparing himself to, lying stretched on his bed and feeling the penetration, the infusion of his body by divine radiance. He is a second Danae lying there on his bed. That's one important thing that we have to make sure to comprehend here in order to understand what he's getting at the end of that paragraph. The second thing, the sweet influence thing. He's making a very specific reference, which I want to make sure I explain. Yeah, Veronica, I'm not sure why Dana, D-A-N-A, that's what my text had. I was wondering if that was actually an error, because D-A-N-A-E is the normal spelling. Dana, I suppose, would be the English version of it, but to call somebody a second Dana is a little bit weird. As I was assuming, I took this text that I'm using on the slide from an electronic text, which I was assuming had made a mistake, that they got auto-corrected or something there. Good. David said that his text says Danae. I would have assumed that it would. Anyway, that's why I read it that way. Sweet influence. Okay, so according to medieval and Renaissance cosmology, the planets and the stars they exert influence upon the world. So like the rays of the stars and of the planets and the sun, and which is one of the planets, of course, it comes into, and it has many different kinds of influences on the world. They have many different kinds of influences on the world. The planets, they have influence on the material of the world. That is, metals come from them. That's where gold comes from, by the way. The sun, right? Sunlight causes gold. Trust me, it happens. The light of Venus produces copper, right? Okay, yeah. So anyhow, so that's one. That's one, but it's only a minor thing. It also affects people, right? It influences people. That exactly, Colette, is where lunacy comes from. That kind of madness is one of the ways in which the influences of the moon can act upon people and bring about madness, often temporary madness. Mars absolutely does cause iron, Stephen. And now for the bonus round, what metal does Jupiter cause? Anyway, okay, so it affects people. This is also where the idea of people being affected at their birth came from as well. That if you are born when, like, Saturn, for instance, heaven help you, was dominant. Saturn that's in Fortuna Major. That's like the bad planet that makes horrible disasters happen. You're likely to have an unlucky life if Saturn was dominant at your birth. Sarah, you've got it. Tin is the metal inspired by Jupiter. Very good. Very good. Mercury is easy. Mercury. But anyway. Okay. So they also influence not just individual people, but also events. That is, to, like, the outbreak of wars and calamities, as well as, great good, like plenty of harvest and things like that. These are all things that are under the influence of different planets. So it was believed that the Earth was sort of the center of these influences of the planets. So Ransom is the experience that he actually has in space, right? Is he finds it to be what he is doing here, and what Lewis is dramatizing in this paragraph is a total paradigm shift on Ransom's part. Remember that last slide from last time, that the concept of space, the cold, empty vacuity, right? The emptiness that lies, the infinite, resounding emptiness that lies outside our atmosphere, was something which had been a source of terror to him in his imagination through his entire life. And here, finding himself in space, he finds that he has to completely reorient himself, right? He is not any longer... he's in space, and he finds himself not to be an emptiness, but to be surrounded by glory, right? As he's looking out, and you see this beautiful description of the stars with no atmosphere, right? And the radiance of the sun, again, not dimmed by atmosphere. He is... he finds the experience to be almost the opposite of what his own imagination, sort of prompted by his sort of cultural context, what it led him to imagine. And he, of course, Ransom, is, a philology don, so he's read quite a bit of old books. So he knows all about the medieval ideas of space. And they never used the word space, of course, they called it the heavens. And when he gets out there, he has this reorientation where he realizes, you know what? It's more like what the medievals said than what the moderns imagine, right? And so notice, he doesn't actually say that his body was in fact being filled with sweet influences, like he's being acted upon and changed by the radiance of the heavens. He doesn't actually say that, right? Almost he felt, wholly he imagined, sweet influence pouring or even stabbing into his surrendered body, right? One of the points of this is the surrender. His surrender to this new idea, to this reorientation of his imagination, right? Of his mythic concepts. And recognizing that there is some, this. So one of the things you could say that Lewis is doing here in this passage is saying, what if there's more to the old myths than we think, right? That's not to say that they're exactly right about everything, right? But what if they're not totally wrong either? What if in some ways, at least, the old concept of the heavens is more real, is more true than the modern concept of space? You're right, Stephen. Ransom has definitely read the right sort of books. Yeah. Veronica, I cannot explain their casual but insistent nudity on the ship. I don't get it either. Yeah, no, I've never fully understood like why they all sort of take for granted that being naked the whole time is the best idea. Don't understand. Yes, Devora, exactly. I agree with you. Presumably Weston and Divine don't feel like this, right? Maybe because they're not surrendered, she asked, still focused on their own ideas. Yes, Devora, and I think we have some very positive evidence about that. You'll remember there is one piece of hand-waving that Lewis does do about the motive power of the spaceship, right? He only makes one extremely vague gesture towards explaining how the ship travels through space. Do you remember what it is? Remember what it is? Yes, David, exactly. He's taking advantage of a hitherto unknown property of sunlight, right? There is something in the solar rays which he has discovered and which he has learned to harness. We don't know what it is. We don't know how he's harnessed it. Those are all, anyway, trade secrets, and Weston wouldn't tell you. But that's it. So, Devora, you see the significance of that, right? Weston not only has reason to suspect that there is power in the rays of the sun. He's proved it scientifically. His entire ship runs on it, right? He knows his whole thing is that he discovered that the rays of the sun have a power and a potency beyond what is normally experienced and perceived by people, and something that is unimagined by most other modern people. And yet, Devore, he does not have Ransom's experience here, right? He does not seem to share Ransom's perspective. And the difference, it's not that he's unaware of it, it's that he's not surrendered to it. And I think that that's really interesting, right? I think it's not for nothing that we're told that one little thing, right? Exactly, Devora. Weston's whole attitude is to exploit those properties, right? And therefore, in a sense, to appropriate them. His power, in a sense, is based upon the power that he is harnessing out of the sun, right? The power that he has identified and is making use of. It's in that sense, that is about him, right? He is self-centered in that way, or rather has that kind of a self-centered outlook on, certainly contrasted with Ransom's surrender here to the sweet influences. Yeah. Yeah, good. Okay, let's keep going. But Ransom, as time wore on, became aware of another and more spiritual cause for his progressive lightening and exaltation of heart. A nightmare, long engendered in the modern mind by the mythology that follows in the wake of science, was falling off him. He had read of space. At the back of his thinking for years had lurked the dismal fantasy of the black, cold vacuity, the utter deadness which was supposed to separate the worlds. He had not known how much it affected him till now. Now that the very name space seemed a blasphemous libel for this empyrean ocean of radiance in which they swam. He could not call it dead. He felt life pouring into him from it every moment. How indeed should it be otherwise, since out of this ocean the worlds and all their life had come? He had thought it barren. He saw now that it was the womb of worlds, whose blazing and innumerable offspring looked down nightly, even upon the earth with so many eyes, and here, with how many more? No, space was the wrong name. Older thinkers had been wiser when they named it simply the heavens, the happy climes that lie where day never shuts his eye up in the broad fields of the sky. He quoted Milton's words to himself lovingly, at this time and often. Yeah, Stephen, he's totally read the right books. The important concept that Lewis is introducing here and which Ransom is wrestling with, right, is the sort of the latent and unspoken, this idea of the mythology that follows in the wake of science, right? That this is, and I agree with Lewis, a very important concept, right? There are many things which, and I think Lewis argues, and I agree with him, that in the modern world, there's often a very general lack of distinction about this. One of the myths that he talks about a lot is sort of the myth, which is the modern myth, which is most generally associated with evolution, right? The evolutionary myth. Now, keep in mind, this is Lewis we're talking about. He does not use the word myth in the modern sense, right? The way that moderns use the word myth to mean something that's false, but people believe it anyway, right? That's kind of the modern definition of the word myth, and Lewis almost never uses the word in that sense, right? A myth is a much more important thing, right? It is a thing that people believe in. It is a concept. It is like an archetypal idea, right? And the point that he's making about space here, right, is that as we have come to learn more about the solar system, and as we have, up through the 30s, speculated more and more about what, space is like, a mythology has grown up in the modern mind. I mean, this is this happens. Like, it's not like people are, he's accusing people of like perpetuating myths in order to deceive people or convince people or something like that. It's how we think, right? We create mythologies, and if we're not conscious of it, like if you're a person who, doesn't like mythology and dislikes mythology, it just means that the mythology that you are invested in is going to be unexamined by you, right? That's Lewis's argument, anyway, that like we as human beings are inveterate myth makers, and we just so like that, and again, what he's pointing to here is the link between the mere statements of fact, which are the result of scientific observation, right, and the concept and the ideas that they evoke, right? The concepts, the feelings, the overall sort of worldview that they bring forward, right? That they encourage. That's what he is. That's what he's sort of pointing to here. Yeah. So when I mentioned the evolutionary myth, again, the point is not that Lewis actually said on several occasions that he says he's not really 100% sure that he's convinced in evolution, but his objections to it are not scientific. Like he doesn't have any necessary objection to the idea of evolution, that is, of gradual changes over time occurring in the biological world. What he's talking about is the myth that underlies it. The myth that he points to there is the myth of progress, right? This idea that the world is trending to like greater and greater perfection and greater, that there is this natural drive in the universe towards progress and perfection. That's the myth that underlies and, as he argues, supports the evolution. Like he's like, there's a reason that the doctrine, the teaching of evolution has become is like seized upon so quickly because it's in sync with that mythic idea, which was already growing, which is already there in the 19th century, even before Darwin published. Anyway, let's keep going. This is the overheard conversation, right? So Ransom outside the door hears Divine talking to Weston, and he can't hear Weston's side. All he can hear is Divine's side. I love this as a literary technique on Lewis's part because of the way that it invites us to fill in the blanks, right? Invites us to imagine Weston's half of the conversation, right? "How should I know?" said Divine. "It may be some sort of chief, much more likely a mumbo-jumbo." This time came a very short utterance from the control room, apparently a question. Divine answered at once. "It would explain why he was wanted." Weston asked him something more. "Human sacrifice, I suppose. At least it wouldn't be human from their point of view, you know what I mean?" Weston had a good deal to say this time, and it elicited Divine's characteristic chuckle. Quite, he said. "It is understood that you are doing it all from the highest motives. So long as they lead to the same actions as my motives, you are quite welcome to them." Weston continued, and this time Divine seemed to interrupt him. "You're not losing your own nerve, are you?" he said. He was then silent for some time, as if listening. Finally, he replied, "If you're so fond of the brutes as that, you'd better stay and interbreed. If they have sexes, which we don't yet know. Don't you worry. When the time comes for cleaning the place up, we'll save one or two for you, and you can keep them as pets or vivisect them or sleep with them or all three, whichever way it takes you." "Yes, I know. Perfectly loathsome. I was only joking. Good night." What do we learn from this conversation? Yes, good. David Urbach says Divine reveals his severe amorality. Yes, exactly. Note the contrast between Weston and Divine implicit in it is understood that you are doing it all from the highest motives, right? Weston had a good deal to say that we don't hear. We don't need to hear it because we've heard it before, right? What's he responding to? Why is Weston making a long speech there? Based on what we've seen of Weston, how can we fill in that long blank there, right? What's he saying? Yes, Devore, he's justifying why it's okay to bring another human being to sacrifice to the chief or mumbo jumbo or whoever it is, right? Or whatever it is. Weston has acknowledged back in that initial conversation with Divine on Earth, right, about why it was better to take the neighbor boy than it was to take Ransom. Whereas remember, Divine was all practicality, right? Yeah, no, the difference is it's much better to take Ransom than the boy because Scotland Yard could come looking for the boy fairly soon and nobody's going to come looking for Ransom for months, right? That was Divine's only consideration. Weston's consideration was based on his ideals. Ransom is at least a human being were the words that he used, right? And even to Ransom, he acknowledged that he was infringing his rights, right? But, he'd do it again and more because obviously the ends justify the means, so it doesn't matter. And his life is small and unimportant compared with the big deal. But still, that's clearly the kind of speech that he's giving, right? It's only because the ends justify the means that he agrees with this. So we get that reinforced, but we see very clearly the difference with divine. It is understood that you're doing it all from the highest motives. So long as they lead to the same actions as my motives, you're quite welcome to them, right? Divine making no attempt to conceal or deceive about the fact that his motives are to... he's not a believer, right? He does not share Weston's ideals. He doesn't care anything about the future of the human race. In a sense, of course, he believes in the ends justifying the means, but he doesn't even need justification, right? He is, in that sense, David, I agree with you, amoral. David Etley says, the relationship of Weston and divine seems like a synecdoche of the relationship between science and industrial capitalism. There you go, Karita. There's a possible answer. If they were in a morality play, what would their names be? Science and capitalism? That would work. I'm not saying it's the only possible name pairing, but, you know, you could write that play. That would work. Yes, Robert, you're right that divine does seem to impute some sympathy for the inhabitants to Weston, right? Weston says all this idealistic, his idealistic stuff, and then divine is like, whatever, right? But then he continues, and divine says, you're not losing your own nerve, are you? And then, if you're so fond of the brutes, is Weston therefore saying in that the thing that Weston is saying that divine interrupts with "you're not losing your own nerve"? Is he wondering whether or not they are quite justified in killing the natives of this planet? Perhaps, at least. Again, I don't know that Weston would question his ultimate justification, but sort of acknowledging that, it's not just as the killing of Ransom is not trivial, right? It's less important, obviously, than the end, but it's not non-existent, right? It is a factor. Is he acknowledging a similar kind of factor? In the rest of it. I agree, Devora. It's not that I see him balking exactly at killing the natives. I don't think he questions the ultimate justification, but he might be saying something like, because notice, one of the things that he's responding to is still back when divine said human sacrifice, at least it wouldn't be human from their point of view. You know what I mean, right? Is he, Weston, speculating about the sort of human or quasi-human status of the natives? Are they rational species? Again, I don't think he's going to balk at killing them for the good of humanity. That's his ideal. But, James Stevens asks, it makes you wonder what divine brings to the mission. Capital, I'm almost positive, right? This is an investment by divine. He's put money into this project, and plans to get money out of it. So that seems to be the reason for the partnership there. We have not heard yet that it is their plan to kill the natives. Well, Jocelyn, we don't until the end there, right? Divine does plainly, when he talks about cleaning the place up, it's pretty clear that he's talking about exterminating the natives. He's talking about genocide there. That's why he alludes to saving one or two for you, and you can keep them as pets or vivisect them or sleep with them or all three. But yeah, the fact that divine starts teasing him about wanting to stay and interbreed does suggest to me that Weston is speculating about the status of the natives of Malacandra, that they are rational species. Um, uh, yeah, yeah. Um, Yeah, Coed is wondering if maybe Weston is saying something that weighs like alien genocide against human sacrifice, is one worse than the other in his mind. Um, uh, yeah, I mean, very possibly so. Um, Again, I don't think that he would be hesitating, though he's clearly hesitating enough to make Divine interrupt and ask him if he's hesitating, right? You're not losing your own nerve, are you? That's, I think, clearly how Divine would characterize having a moral qualm, right? Would be losing your nerve to do what needs to be done in order to achieve the end. Yeah, Karita, I agree. It is very impressive how Weston managed, or Divine rather, managed to get slavery, rape, and torture all into one punchline. Yep, you are absolutely right. And notice the sort of jocular casualness with which he alludes to all three: slavery, torture, and rape. Yeah, absolutely. That's Divine. Though he knew it would be that it would be prudent to return to his bed as quickly as possible, he found himself standing still in the now familiar glory of the light and viewing it with a new and poignant emotion. Out of this heaven, these happy climes, they were presently to descend into what? Sorns? Human sacrifice? Loathsome, sexless monsters? What was a Sorn? His own role in the affair was now clear enough. Somebody or something had sent for him. It could hardly be for him personally. The somebody wanted a victim, any victim, from Earth. He had been picked because Divine had done the picking. He realized for the first time, in all circumstances a late and startling discovery, that Divine had hated him all these years as heartily as he hated Divine. Another one of those small reorientations, right? But those kinds of reorientations are happening throughout, right? He has always despised Divine, and now realized that Divine has always despised him as well. And that had served as an extra motive. Yes, it was more practical. Yes, he won't be missed, and so therefore is the perfect victim from Divine's point of view. But as a bonus, he's also that sniveling little prig, from grammar school, from public school, which whom Divine has always hated. Somebody or something had sent for him. The irony of this passage I find very poignant. I was suggesting at the beginning that we see some evidence that Ransom has in a sense been called, right? That Ransom ends up where he ends up because of doing the right thing, because he found himself in this situation without his control, outside of his control, like meeting the worried mom, right, in the dark, and made her a promise to do the right thing, followed through on his promise to do the right thing, even though it was awkward, and ended up being taken. And, so he was, and now it turns out he was called, right? In this sense of calling, he has, not in some kind of great and grand way, like, some other power was at work there. That's not the kind of calling that he perceives. Instead, it turns out, or it seems to be turning out, to be a horrible calling, right? He has been summoned to execution. He has been summoned to be sacrificed to some, some pagan god, or more likely, in Divine's view, some mumbo jumbo, right? Some primitive statue that these savages all worship, right? That's what he sort of has in mind. And you're right, David, that Ransom also had been rather self-focused, right? We see him focused outward in his surrender to the heavens and the reorientation of his perspective there. But he does have this, that there is still within him, I agree with you, that tendency to sort of think of himself, very naturally, right? Not criticizing, but you're right about that tendency. But what was a Sorn? When he saw them, he would eat out of Weston's hands, quoting Divine there. His mind, like so many minds of his generation, was richly furnished with bogies. He had read his H.G. Wells and others. His universe was peopled with horrors such as ancient and medieval mythology could hardly rival. No insect-like, vermiculate, or crustacean abominable. No twitching feelers, rasping wings, slimy coils, curling tentacles. No monstrous union of superhuman intelligence and insatiable cruelty seemed to him anything but likely on an alien world. By the way, how awesome is that sentence? I love that sentence. No insect-like, vermiculate, or crustacean abominable. I love that phrase. Oh, man. Vermiculate is the word of the day, by the way. It means, I believe, worm-like, right? But anyhow, okay. The Sorns would be, he dared not think what the Sorns would be. And he was to be given to them. Somehow this seemed more horrible than being caught by them. Given, handed over, offered. He saw in imagination various incompatible monstrosities, bulbous eyes, grinning jaws, horns, stings, mandibles, loathing of insects, loathing of snakes, loathing of things that squashed and squelched, all played their horrible symphonies over his nerves. But the reality would be worse. It would be an extraterrestrial otherness, something one had never thought of, never could have thought of. In that moment, Ransom made a decision. He could face death, but not the Sorns. He must escape when they got to Malacandra, if there were any possibility. Starvation, or even to be chased by Sorns, would be better than being handed over. If escape were impossible, then it must be suicide. Ransom was a pious man. He hoped he would be forgiven. It was no more in his power, he thought, to decide otherwise than to grow a new limb. Without hesitation, he stole back into the galley and secured the sharpest knife. Henceforward, he determined never to be parted from it. Yeah, Karita asks, is Ransom Catholic? I can't think, Karita, of any positive evidence that would suggest it in the text. I mean, of course, it's tempting to think he's Catholic because he's a philologist, kind of like Tolkien, and so, is he Catholic? And I hear you, Karita. That, I mean, I assume you're asking that because the reference to suicide and hoping you would be forgiven makes you think of it. It's a great question. Yeah, I think it's not impossible, but I don't think it's important, or else we would have been told. And if anyone else can think of any actual reference in the text which would seem to prove one way or another Ransom's flavor of Christianity, I would be interested to hear it. But I can't think that there is. And I also can't think that that's a mistake on Lewis's part. I don't think he wants to pigeonhole him in that way. But yeah, 3 of you right in a row. 3 of you right in a row asked if Lewis had ever read Lovecraft. Better Lewis scholars than I will be able to confirm that. I think so, but I can't off the top of my head remember an explicit reference. But if I had to guess, I would say yes. If I had to guess, I'd say yes. Let me make a note. Somebody remind me. Somebody, I don't have time to write it down. Somebody remind me. I'm gonna do what I always do when somebody asks me a C.S. Lewis question I can't answer. Ask Brenton Dickinson, also on our Signum faculty, and who just successfully defended his C.S. Lewis dissertation. I'll ask Brenton. He'll know. I think so, but anyway, okay. But yeah, my guess is yes, that he has read Lovecraft. Anyway, okay. Notice an interesting thing here. I've been talking about how Weston and Devine are two sort of representatives of the modern perspective, right? Of different elements in the modern perspective. It's important to remember that Ransom does not stand outside that. Ransom also is a representative of the modern world. And Ransom, of course, the difference is that Ransom is willing to let go of some of his modern prejudices, and Ransom acknowledges and feels these myths, and Lewis certainly draws our attention to them, right? But these reactions when thinking about being handed over to this alien race, the kind of the mythology about aliens that has grown up in the modern mind, fueled by people like H.G. Wells and people like Lovecraft, has, also bred a kind of dark mythology, right? That has invested the meeting of aliens with horror, right? By the way, I think that this is another one of those perspectives that's difficult to recapture, because so many alien stories since the 1930s have worked to change this, right? I mean, it's kind of hard living in a world that includes Baby Yoda from The Mandalorian, right? To have exactly the same feeling of visceral horror and terror that Ransom has when imagining meeting an alien, right? And that's only the latest example in a long line of much more, of some very different concepts of meeting aliens, right? Anyway, we will see more of him wrestling with this. But again, it's important to recall that Ransom is a child of the modern world as well, and he participates in this. He is a victim of and a participant in these modern mythologies. This is as inveterate for him as it was for about the space, right? Yeah. Yeah, good. Yes, kid, exactly. Knowing very little about what we might encounter in other planets, we were expecting to meet to be less intelligent but more pretty than aliens. Yes, exactly. Yeah, good. Okay, let's keep going. But, sorry, one last point about the suicide business at the end. This is a big deal, right? Ransom was a pious man. He hoped he would be forgiven. Lewis is making this extreme statement, right? Ransom, operating within the perspective that he has always had as a member of the modern world. In this moment that he is imagining this being handed over to an alien race for sacrifice, he is overpowered completely by it. It is so strong. These feelings of horror and terror are so strong that they overcome even his moral convictions, which are very, very strongly held, right? He is a pious man. He very strongly believes that suicide is wrong, that suicide is a sin. But in the face of this, all he can do is hope to be forgiven, right? So one of the things that Lewis is pointing out is how even if you don't just line up with the modern world, even if you are deviating from the modern world insofar as to be, say, a Christian, you are, these two sort of competing mythologies will still like be at war within you, and the one can easily overcome the other, as we see it doing here. Okay, interesting. So yeah, Takako's pointing out that Lovecraft died in 1937, and Out of the Silent Planet was written in 1938. Yes, but his Lovecraft's stories had already been published, hadn't they, for some time by that time? I know that Lewis was reading like weird tales and like science fiction, magazines and stuff like that. Like he definitely read that stuff. Yeah. That's why I assume he has, because you could definitely find Lovecraft in those kinds of periodicals. Okay, good. The Call of Cthulhu was published in 1928. Yeah, I think it's possible. Okay, excellent. Robert, thank you. Robert Brown, always so faithful in doing research for me. Robert has been correcting my errors and supplying my deficiencies for many, many years in these classes and through my podcast. Thank you, Robert. Robert is quoting Dale Nelson, who says, "It's virtually certain that Lewis was buying the magazine Astounding in the mid-30s when the Lovecraft stories appeared there. In his book, The Great Divorce, he acknowledges influence from a story published in an American science fiction magazine." That's what I was thinking of, Robert, when I just said that. This story was Colossus by Donald Wandre, published in the January 1934 issue. So it is definitely known that Lewis was reading these science fiction journals, or not journals, but these science fiction magazines and collections. So that's why I believe, again, I wish that I could think of a reference somewhere in Lewis's works explicitly and unquestionably to Lovecraft. But I can't come up with one off the top of my head. But yes, I certainly agree that it seems to me very, very likely that he had read him. Yes, Amber says Lewis was reading the right magazines. Yes, exactly. That's exactly right. Okay. Yeah, Takako, I would not surprise me if H.P. Lovecraft... Takako was just saying that Lovecraft might have hated the space trilogy. I think that's very possible. Very possible. Okay, all right. Hey, guess where we are? Chapter 6, like I said we'd get to. This is his experience as they're descending into the atmosphere of Malacandra, and he is experiencing the diminution of the light. And it became certain, too, though the phenomenon was hard to seize, that the light was less overwhelming than it had been at the beginning of the voyage. It became certain to the comparing intellect, but it was difficult to feel what was happening as a diminution of light, and impossible to think of it as darkening, because while the radiance changed in degree, its unearthly quality had remained exactly the same since the moment he first beheld it. It was not like fading light upon the earth, mixed with the increasing moisture and phantom colors of the air. You might have its intensity, Random perceived, and the remaining half would still be what the whole had been, merely less, not other. Have it again, and the residue would still be the same. As long as it was at all, it would be itself, out even to that unimagined distance where its last force was spent. He tried to explain what he meant to Divine. "Like thin gummy soap," grinned Divine. Pure soap to the last bubble, eh? This is another lovely little glimpse into Divine's character, of course. Here is Ransom contemplating... Remember, what was it that Weston was hoping that this journey might put within their reach? Infinity, and therefore possibly eternity. And this is exactly what Ransom is contemplating, right? Ransom has, in a very different sense, been given eternity and infinity, right? He has been brought through this journey to experience infinity and eternity in new and different ways. And this realization, as the light is diminishing, as they descend, or as they approach, I guess I should say, he's beginning to understand how, even as like, yes, the further away from the sun you go, the less its light the less intense its light becomes, right? That's known. That's definitely going to happen. But that doesn't mean that this power, this mythic potency of the heavens that he's imagining here would tail off, right? Anyway. Yeah. And then, but Divine, what's Divine's closest approach to trying to understand what Ransom is attempting to explain to him about infinity and eternity? An advertising slogan, right? He makes a joke comparing it to an advertising slogan, pure soap to the last bubble, right? He can't even remember the name of the particular soap, right? That's being advertised. I have a theory about Divine. There's a word that Lewis and Tolkien both use sometimes, almost never within their, well, very rarely in their fiction, but not infrequently in their nonfiction prose, their essays. And I've never been 100% sure that I know exactly what they mean by this word. The word is vulgar. When they use the word vulgar, call somebody vulgar, as famously Tolkien on at least 2 occasions calls Walt Disney vulgar. And the word obviously does not have, so one of the modern uses of the word vulgar, of course, means using bad language. And I think it's pretty clear that he's not accusing Walt Disney of being vulgar in that sense. Anyway, I've never been 100% sure that I've really conceptually grasped in full what exactly they're conveying by that word vulgar, because they're clearly using it in different ways than I do. I get a general sense, but I've always felt like there are nuances that I don't understand. Yeah. I agree, John and Bruce, that there's a connected with commonness, like low class. Yes. But what element of low class? It's not only a snobbish statement, right? It's not, to call someone vulgar is to say more than just to say that he's not our kind of person, right? There's more to, anyway. Divine's joke, his bringing Ransom's description of eternity and infinity back to an advertising slogan. If I had to point to an illustration of what I am guessing Lewis is pointing to when he uses the word vulgar, it would be that line. Maybe I'm wrong, but maybe I'm wrong. But I think that Divine is a vulgar man in the sense, again, there's more to him than that. He's more than just vulgar. He's much worse than just that. But But anyway, yeah, yeah, and no, yes, several of you are sort of defining vulgar as being, of or relating to common people. Yes, no, I'm familiar with that definition, but what does it mean? Like, what elements of the common people exactly? So, like, for instance, the word villain also means relating to common people. That's what the word comes from, right? Villain just means peasant. So like villain, barbarian, and vulgar are three words which all come from the same thing, right? That all have that sort of class-oriented thing. But they mean very, like they have, it's the connotations of the word that I don't feel like, that I'm not, I want to make sure I'm understanding better. Anyway, okay. Yes, Arthur, you are absolutely right that whatever else that line is, it is a piece of divine comedy. Yes. Have to give you props for that one, Arthur. Okay. By the way, I'm not thinking I'm going to solve the answer to like what vulgar means. I'm doing the only thing I can do, which is trying to understand in the big picture of like things that they describe and how they use the word and various contexts to try to get a kind of inductive sense of what that word means to them. Anyway. Okay. Here's another one of those reorientations. What had been a chariot gliding in the fields of heaven became a dark steel box dimly lighted by a slit of window and falling. They were falling out of the heaven into a world. Nothing in all his adventures bit so deeply into Ransom's mind as this. He wondered how he could ever have thought of planets, even of the earth, as islands of life and reality floating in a deadly void. Now, with a certainty which never after deserted him, he saw the planets, the earths, he called them in his thought, as mere holes or gaps in the living heaven, excluded and rejected wastes of heavy matter and murky air, formed not by addition to, but by subtraction from the surrounding brightness. And yet, he thought, beyond the solar system the brightness ends. Is that the real void? The real death? Unless, he groped for the idea, unless visible light is also a hole or gap, a mere diminution of something else? Something that is to bright unchanging heaven, as heaven is to the dark heavy earths? Things do not always happen as a man would expect. The moment of his arrival in an unknown world found Ransom wholly absorbed in a philosophical speculation. This reversal of that modern mythology, and this is the space mythology, right? This is that mythology that was attached to the word space that so terrified him. The idea that our planet, right, the radically anthropocentric viewpoint that imagines our planet as being this oasis of light and life and activity and thought and creativity, and then the empty, dark void surrounds it, reaching out to all eternity, right? This, by the way, loops back around thinking of the heavens and of space to one of the points that Lewis makes, I think, very convincingly, very, very appropriately when talking about the shift from the medieval to the modern viewpoint. A lot of modern people talk as if the shift from the modern, the old geocentric concept of the solar system, the shift from the geocentric to the heliocentric solar system was a shift making man less central, less important. It is the opposite of what actually happened. And Lewis has shown this very clearly when you look at how medieval people actually talked about the geocentric world. They believed, yes, that the Earth was the sort of the geometric center of the solar system, but it wasn't the most important thing. It was the opposite. It was the offscouring of the universe. It was the garbage tip of the solar system. Another pop quiz. According to Dante, what is at the center of the world? What is the very center of the entire solar system? Satan. Exactly. Wait, and good. David's got it. More specifically, Satan's genitals. Yes. Satan's penis is the center of the world. Like literally at the gravitational center of the earth. Exactly. Hell is the center of the world. Satan is at the center of hell. Satan's genitalia are at the center of Satan. The very gravitational center of the world is Satan's groin. That is to say, being the center does not mean it's the most important. And also, by contrast, if you read the writings of people like Galileo and others, they saw the shift, right? The reconception of the solar system, not as a demotion of the Earth. Like, we no longer can we deceive ourselves that the Earth is the most important thing in the solar system. They saw it as a promotion. They said, now the Earth can take its place among the heavens, right? Now we know that we are operating on equal. This was a step in the direction of humanism and the Enlightenment, a step in the direction of an elevated view of the importance of man. Not the other way around. So Ransom's shifting of perspective here, his final solution, right? His final healing, right, from this modern myth of space and what the world is and contrasted to space is this absolute reversal, right? The Earths are not islands of life and reality floating in a deadly void. But they are excluded and rejected wastes of heavy matter and murky air formed not by addition to, but by subtraction from the surrounding brightness. Now, in some ways, of course, his attitude towards the planets is a little bit more negative than he will later hold. He will continue to come to understand better as he moves forward. Arthur says I shouldn't use the phrase "final solution" with Divine and Weston around. They might run with that. True enough. Yeah, good. Anyway, so this is the more change will happen to this perspective, but nevertheless, this is a radical shift and a type of the sort of radical shift that's going to be happening that Lewis is introducing through his subcreation. This again, if there is a point of this piece of science fiction, it is not to guess about what the future might look like and how things might work in the future, right? The point of this is the point of this, to travel, to be transplanted onto a distant world, and by doing so, have many of the things that we take for granted about the world and the universe shifted, changed, even turned on their heads, right? Okay. So he's kept real busy, so he doesn't have time to just sort of do sightseeing when he first steps out of the spaceship onto Malacandra. But something he learned. Before anything else, he learned that Malacandra was beautiful. And he even reflected how odd it was that this possibility had never entered into his speculations about it. The same peculiar twist of imagination which led him to people the universe with monsters had somehow taught him to expect nothing on a strange planet except rocky desolation, or else a network of nightmare machines. He could not say why now that he had come to think of it. He also discovered that the blue water surrounded them on at least 3 sides. His view in the 4th direction was blotted out by the vast steel football in which they had come. The hut, in fact, was built either on the point of a peninsula or on the end of an island. He also came little by little to the conclusion that the water was not merely blue in certain lights like terrestrial water, but really blue. There was something about its behavior under the gentle breeze which puzzled him. Something wrong or unnatural about the waves. For one thing, they were too big for such a wind. But that was not the whole secret. They reminded him of something he had read in one of those modern poets about a sea rising in turreted walls. Okay, so several things here. One, again, another sort of add-on to this mythological shift that he's undergoing, right? Just as he by default imagines aliens to be monsters of unlimited intelligence and insatiable cruelty. So he also imagined space to be an empty vacuity. And so he also imagined alien worlds to be one of two things, either rocky desolation or a network of nightmare machines. The idea that he lands on this planet and discovers it to be beautiful is something that he had never expected. David asks, how much uncertainty are we as readers supposed to have about which planet they're on? I don't think he's meaning to make it too hard. I mean, he's going to find out for sure. That will be known. And he's dropping enough clues over the course of chapter 6 to 10 for us to be able to guess with some certainty, especially once we get to the Handramits and the Harandra. That is to his sort of, no, well, not discovery, but teaching, being taught about the topography of the planet. But it's not yet important, I would say, David, which one it is. As I think that's the primary reason that he hasn't said it, and I've been trying not to say it yet either. The first thing that happens is Ransom's experience of the new world, and the renewal and the alteration of his mythological assumptions, of his perspectives, and just sort of assumptions about how things work. The first thing to happen is that his whole orientation has to change first. After that, he learns not only which planet this is, but its place and how it relates. So basically, identifying this planet with which planet in earthly terms it is part of the process of Ransom's applying his new perspective to the larger issue, but basically looking back towards Earth, essentially. Good. Okay. The other thing. There is one interesting way in which I think one of the ways in which I've said that Lewis is doing subcreation here, and that the kind of subcreation he does in this book is very similar to the kind of subcreation that happens in a fantasy work, right? It's not very different. The one way in which the subspecies of fantasy that's happening here is of a more science fiction kind than let me say this a different way. The thing that Out of the Silent Planet has in common more with the War of the Worlds than it does with the Lord of the Rings is that the fundamental what if frame, it's not about what if, the ancient stories about elves have some grounding in truth, and there really was a time when the elves were dominant in history and magic was still functioning in the world. That's not his concept, right? And the concept isn't that. It's not that kind of an if. The kind of what if that he's asking is fundamentally a scientific what if. Imagine you're on a different planet, and he takes some elements of some scientific speculations as the premise of his what if, right? And specifically, the number one most dominant element, I would say, in his subcreation is, what if you were on a planet that had a lighter gravity than ours, but it had all these other things? It has running water. It has weather. It has wind and stuff. It has plants. It has animals, right? It has rational species. But given that all of this is happening in a world with a lighter gravitational pull, a lesser gravitational pull than the Earth, what would that mean? How would that change things, right? And that is a science fiction-ish kind of speculation, right, to base it on. And this is the first glimpse that we get of that here. What's wrong about the waves is that their shape is wrong. The water isn't reacting like it reacts on Earth. It looks like turreted walls, right? The waves are too tall and pointy. They shouldn't be that tall and pointy. Water is not behaving on this planet like it behaves on Earth because the gravity is lesser, right? And we see this, of course, in many of the things that he sees and is impressed by right away. Baffled by this, he turned his attention to the nearer shore beyond the shallows. The purple mass looked for a moment like a plump of organ pipes, then like a stack of rolls of cloth set up on end, then like a forest of gigantic umbrellas blown inside out. It was in faint motion. Suddenly his eyes mastered the object. The purple stuff was vegetation. More precisely, it was vegetables. Vegetables about twice the height of English elms, but apparently soft and flimsy. The stalks, one could hardly call them trunks, rose smooth and round and surprisingly thin for about 40 feet. Above that, the huge plants opened into a sheaf-like development, not of branches, but of leaves, leaves large as lifeboats, but nearly transparent. The whole thing corresponded roughly to his idea of a submarine forest. The plants, at once so large and so frail, seemed to need water to support them, and he wondered that they could hang in the air. Lower down, between the stems, he saw the vivid purple twilight, mottled with paler sunshine, which made up the internal scenery of the wood. What would plants be like growing in a world with lower gravity than ours, right? And here is his speculation, right? Here's his answer. Here's his subcreative answer to the what if, right? Plants don't grow this way on Earth because they would collapse under their own weight, right? But if they didn't collapse under their own weight, they might grow very differently, right? And this is a really, this is really fun. Nancy, you are absolutely not alone. If the description of the Malacandrian landscape makes you imagine Dr. Seuss drawings, you are very much not alone. I find Dr. Seuss's images to sort of infect my imagination at many points when I am listening to the description of the Malacandrian countryside here. Okay. Almost out of time. It's at least part ransom from Weston and Devine. At first he could not see clearly what they were pointing at. There seemed to be some paler and slenderer plants than he had noticed among the purple ones. He hardly attended to them, for his eyes were busy searching the ground, so obsessed was he with the reptile fears and insect fears of modern imagining. It was the reflection of the new white objects in the water that sent his eyes back to them. Long, streaky, white reflections, motionless in the running water. 4 or 5, no, to be precise, 6 of them. He looked up. 6 white things were standing there. Spindly and flimsy things, twice or 3 times the height of a man. His first idea was that they were images of men, the work of savage artists. He had seen things like them in books of archaeology. But what could they be made of, and how could they stand? So crazily thin and elongated in the leg, so top-heavily pouted in the chest, such stocky, flexible-looking distortions of earthly bipeds. like something seen in one of those comic mirrors. They were certainly not made of stone or metal, for now they seemed to sway a little as he watched. Now, with a shock that chased the blood from his cheeks, he saw that they were alive, that they were moving, that they were coming at him. He had a momentary scared glimpse of their faces, thin and unnaturally long, with long drooping noses and drooping mouths of half-spectral, half-idiotic solemnity. Then he turned wildly to fly and found himself gripped by Divine. Okay, notice the fundamental bias of Ransom's point of view. Why are the Sorns so terrifying? Why are the Sorns so terrifying to him? Can you see the pattern in his description? We'll end after this. This is our last slide. But can you see the pattern in his description? Yes, Stephen, that I think is the heart of it. Yes, Devora, exactly. And Veronica too. They look like people, but not enough like people. Exactly as Fred Rockpaper says on Twitch, they're not quite human, right? It's the proximity, but notice they're appalling to him because the human shape and the human face even are what he's looking for. Notice his descriptions of them. How could they stand, right? So crazily thin? Well, compared to what? And elongated in the leg? Who says what's the right length of a leg? So top-heavily pouted in the chest? Well, okay. So your chests are swollen out, right? Like, who's to say that that's too top-heavy, right? Such stocky, flexible-looking distortions of earthly bipeds. In other words, Ransom approaches the Sorns with an absolutely unquestioned and even unself-conscious anthropocentric perspective, right? He takes humans as the default and is terrified of these creatures, not because they're different, but because of how similar they are. They're in the uncanny valley. David Atley, you're absolutely right. Exact good. Christy and Robert Brown and Takako and Bruce are all talking about this. Yes, the uncanny valley effect is exactly what's happening here. But again, the root of that, right? The foundation of the uncanny valley effect here is that is the assumption that our form is the norm, right? If he were not constantly comparing, if the whole description of, again, the face, right? Thin and unnaturally long drooping noses and drooping mouths of half spectral, half idiotic solemnity, right? If he were not taking the human face as the pattern, right? The pattern, the orthodox pattern of how they should look, and contrasting it with that, he wouldn't have this reaction, right? But he does do that. Ransom is a very terrestrial creature. He is a terrestrial modern. He is different from Weston and Divine. So what we begin to see is that Weston, Divine, and Ransom, the three of them, it's not Ransom here and Weston and Divine over here. I mean, of course, in some ways it is. But in some ways, it's better to think of the three of them separately, right? That Ransom, Weston, and Divine, all three of them represent, or sort of come from different parts of the modern perspective, right? Ransom is he differs from both Weston and Divine, right? But he doesn't differ from them in being outside of their culture or not sharing their basic assumptions. He denies many of their beliefs, right? But if you think about it, these are like, there are different things that, so Ransom and Divine alike disbelieve in they alike disbelieve in Weston's ideals, right? Neither of them agree with Weston's ideals. Weston and Ransom, both of them believe in higher ideals beyond the merely material, beyond the merely pragmatic, right? And in that way, both of them are on one side and divine is on the other side, right? Ransom believes that the means do not justify the ends, and that doing what is right is more important than, cannot be pushed aside for other reasons. And in that way, Weston and divine are together and Ransom is apart. But again, all three of them, just as all three of them are traveling in the same ball through space, right? All of them also share the same fundamental modern earthbound perspective, right? Just as they're traveling through a little round ball that looks like a tiny little planet traveling through space, so they have brought their worldly assumptions with them. Divine and Weston, seemingly almost unquestioningly, right? Almost with almost no self-awareness, right? As if there were any other perspective to be had, right? But that, of course, is the most important gap that's going to open up between one of them on the one hand and two of them on the other hand, right? And that's between Ransom and Weston and divine, is that Ransom is going to come to change. He's going to change. His attention will be drawn to these assumptions and perspectives and sort of mythological frameworks that he brings to the universe as a representative of modern Earth, right? And his encounter with the Sorns, his first encounter with the Sorns here, is completely tainted by it, in fact. All right. We'll stop there, as I said, and we will... Yeah. Okay, hey, folks on Twitch. So it looks like my GoToWebinar just crashed exactly after I said we'll stop there this week. So I'm going to stop there this week. Thanks, everybody. Good night now.
The Mythgard Academy has been offering in-depth discussions of awesome books and films since 2013, completely free to attend and free to download. If you've enjoyed our discussions and would like to help them continue, please consider donating at signumuniversity.org/fund.